Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Rodolfo Dirzo. He's Associate Dean at the Doerr School of Sustainability, being Professor in Environmental Science, Professor of Earth System Science, and Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. His scientific work examines the study of species interactions in tropical ecosystems from California, Latin America, and other tropical areas of the world. And today we're going to talk a little bit about species interactions, hybrid networks, human activity, biodiversity conservation, the sixth mass extinction, defaunation, and other related topics. So, Dr. Dirzo, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ricardo. That sounds like a lot of topics that we want to examine today, but I'll be happy to do as much as we can.
Yeah, let's try to cover at least a few of them. So let's start with species interactions then. Could you start by explaining what species interactions are and why is it important to study them?
Yeah, we tend to think that the ecology, the scientific discipline that addresses the interactions between organisms and their environment, we traditionally have thought that those interactions between organisms and the environment were interactions that had to do with the physical environment. So let's imagine a plant. A plant has to interact with the climate, the soil, those physical aspects of the environment. But the reality is that plants and animals have to interact with other elements of the environment, the biological elements of the environment. So, for example, a plant has to interact with animals that might want to eat the plant, herbivores, or animals that might want to take the pollen and do the fertilization of the flowers and therefore the reproduction of the plants. Plants can be interact with fungi that would be pathogenic or could be assistance in terms of capturing nutrients in the roots. And so really what we want to emphasize with this topic is that the fact that plants and animals and microorganisms, not only do they have to interact with the physical aspects of the environment, the climate, the soil, temperature, and so on, but also with other factors of the environment. And the significance of that, Ricardo, is that, when plants or animals adapt to a given condition of the environment, it is possible that the animals or the interacting organisms with them react to that and create a challenge for the plant. Let's imagine this situation. A plant that lives in a place where the winter comes at a given time of the year, the plant can develop the adaptations to deal with the winter, right? Low temperature, the plant will either drop the leaves or do something. Once they do that solution, that's it. Now, let's suppose a plant is being attacked by an animal. The plant responds by producing some mechanism of defense, let's say a chemical compound. But that's not the definitive answer because the animal can evolve a capacity to deal with that toxin. And now the animal is on top again of the plant, and the plant has to come back again with another interaction. And so in the case of interactions with the physical environment, usually the solutions of the plants or animals or organisms are definite. But in the case of biological interactions, they tend to be escalating, a theme that we call co-evolution. And really, what has happened with the evolution of life on the planet is very much the result of those complex interactions between organisms, species interactions, and co-evolution. That's the significance of this definition of species interactions.
And so, do these species interactions have any influence on how we understand how evolution plays out? Or do they have any specific implications for evolutionary biology?
Absolutely, absolutely. In the history of the development of evolution, we have two prominent figures. One of them was Russell Wallace, the man who was traveling first in South America and then in Southeast Asia. And then he came up with the idea of natural selection. And then Darwin panicked because he had not published his ideas. And so Wallace had this very much, the opinion very much on the physical factors of the environment. And Darwin was of the opinion of physical factors of the environment, but also biological aspects of the environment. And so Darwin, for example, wanted to examine competition and the survival of the fittest, he called it. in an environment, plants and animals compete against each other, or plants and animals benefit each other. And that created many fundamental ideas that he developed in terms of the principles of natural selection. Let's imagine this situation to understand evolution and adaptation via these processes.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that we have a population of plants, and those plants are the subject of food for some animal, say an insect. If for some reason some of the plants within the population have characteristics that prevent them from being eaten compared to other plants, that is to say, the first principle of natural selection, which is variation within a population, then the insects will eat the plants that do not have those characteristics. The plants that have those defensive characteristics will leave more descendants, the second principle of natural selection. And third, if those characteristics are genetically determined, then the plant will have an adaptation as a response, an adaptive response to the selective pressure exerted by the animal. So we can see that these biotic interactions actually reflect splendidly the mechanisms of natural selection leading to adaptations and eventually to evolutionary processes. So that's the significance of those interactions.
And are species interactions influenced in any way by ecology? And if so, how?
Yes, actually, we could say, Ricardo, that ecology is natural selection in action. So the fact that plants and animals and microbes have to be dealing with the challenges of the environment and the variation in environmental characteristics, that is to say, the heterogeneity of the environment in space or time, then that drives pretty much the responses of plants for the challenges and therefore the evolutionary process. Now, another significance of that from the human perspective is that we tend to think of these interactions as things that happen in nature and may not have direct significance to us, but the reality is that they are extremely relevant to us. To give an example, again, coming back to the situation of plants using defensive mechanisms to protect themselves against the attack of animals, well, plants have evolved alkaloids, cyanogenic glycosides, phenolic compounds, many things that our ancestors and now today, we have discovered that they're medicinal products that we can use for our own benefit. So really, for example, penicillin is a result of an interaction between a fungus and its host, and then some people, in this case, some indigenous peoples from central Mexico discovered that fungus actually could be used to address problems of infections of the skin. So that medicine actually came from that interaction. Many plants use salicylic acid, which is basically aspirin, and now we know that salicin is a product that has been derived from the pressure of animals eating these plants in the genus Salix, and then we understood that those are the medicine that we use for painkillers, for example, and the same thing with many alkaloids, caffeine, morphine, and so on and so forth, many of them used for medicinal purposes, and many, many examples of that. And then in terms of what you were asking, sort of the directions of the evolutionary process, there are some beautiful examples. Let's take the case of the very, very well-known situation of the monarch butterfly. This is a beautiful butterfly that everybody knows, or most people know. This is a fantastic migratory species that moves between North America and Central Mexico. Anyway, that fantastic butterfly has caterpillars, and the caterpillars are specialized in eating this particular group of plants called milkweeds. Well, it turns out that these milkweeds produce carotenoid glucosides, some chemical compounds that attack the muscle of the heart of animals. And so it turns out that the caterpillars can actually eat those milkweed plants, despite the fact that those milkweed plants have this very nasty compound. And so the caterpillars actually, when they eat the plants, they have the capacity to diminish the effect, eliminate the effect of the toxin, but then they pass the toxin from the caterpillars to the adult butterfly. And then the adult butterfly has these carotenoids, and it's defended against its predators, the birds. And then the birds learn to detect the the butterflies, the monarch butterflies, because of the coloration. In other words, will try and avoid eating those plants. But then other butterflies will imitate the color of the monarchs to make sure that they also defend themselves, even though they do not produce the defensive chemistry. And so you can see this fantastic network of interactions derived by the complex ecological relationships between organisms, cascading down to a multiplicity of phenomena that occur as a consequence of these simple, apparently simple interactions.
And what are hybrid networks then?
Networks, imagine this situation when you are in a community, in an ecosystem, you will have a list of plant species, for example, and a list of insects that are the pollinators of the plant species, correct? So you want to know which plant species is connected to which pollinator. You also want to know this pollinator to how many plants this is a pollinator of. And so you have this network of species of plants and species of animals connected in this interactive network. But it turns out that the plants are also eaten by animals, the herbivores. And so you want to see what is the herbivore that eat these plants and which are the insects that pollinate these plants. So you have a hybrid interaction of interactions, really. We could say that this is an interaction of interactions, create these hybrid networks. When you have multiple levels of interaction, that becomes a sort of a multi-scale, multi-trophic level hybrid interactions networks.
And so to get a little bit into how human activity might impact these aspects of the ecosystem, can these hybrid networks be disrupted by human activity? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, the answer is yes, and in multiple ways. First of all, Ricardo, the mechanisms. The typical mechanisms in which human activities impact the biodiversity and the functioning and processes of the biodiversity are typically in this order. First of all, we have land use change. That is to say, the transformation of the natural habitats. Everybody has seen images of, say, for example, a tropical ecosystem with a forest coverage taken with a satellite image at a given time. And then you come back at another time and you see how that forest has been disrupted, reduced by deforestation. So that is land use change. Ecosystems and biodiversity are also impacted by overexploitation. Say, for example, the overhunting of elephants in Africa. So overexploitation. And then we have the situation of non-native invasive species. When we humans transport animals or plants from one location to another location, usually those have negative impacts on the natural local communities. Third, and then we have that many of those exotic non-native species are also disease agents. So, for example, an animal can come with a pathogen that will infect the other animals of the place where it went. And then finally, and last but not least, we have climate change as well. Climate change disrupts biodiversity and disrupts all of these interactions. The complexity and the significance of all of this, Ricardo, is that none of these factors operates in isolation. So, for example, they are interacting in complex ways. To simplify an example, if you go to the Amazon and there is a process of land use change, the deforestation and reduction of the habitat, well, that destruction and fragmentation of the habitat facilitates for poachers and hunters to have access to places that in the past they would not have access to because the forest was so extensive, right? So now you have an effect of the reduction of the habitat, which threatens the populations because the small habitat will not be sufficient to maintain a viable population. So that's one factor. And then, but that facilitates the hunting. The hunting per se affects the population. So you have this compound effect between those two things in a synergy. Now bring on to that the effect of climate change, the effect of invasive species. So then we have all of this very complex way of disrupting the abundance, diversity, and the ecological interactions of organisms. And this is an important lesson, Ricardo, because now we understand, and certainly in my laboratory, we are interested particularly in understanding human impact in terms of species, in terms of populations, but also we're particularly interested in understanding the influences, negative influences of human activities on the ecological interactions of organisms. So kind of the mission of our laboratory is to do conservation of ecosystem processes and ecosystem species interaction.
And so one of the ways by which our human activity can change hybrid networks is through agricultural intensification, correct?
Agricultural intensification is one of the most critical drivers of disruption of biodiversity, species interactions, and species networks. We do know, Ricardo, that most of the transformation of land, what is called the land use change, is driven by agricultural intensification, particularly the industrialized agricultural identification. Take the case of the Midwest in the US, extensive areas of states such as Kansas and Illinois, massively transformed in agricultural monocultures for maize, for corn, or for other crops. Take the case of Southeast Asia, the massive transformation of the rainforest for the plantations to produce oil, the African palm oil. And so you can see that this intensification of agriculture, particularly when it's focusing on monocultural agriculture, creates massive disruptions on the land use change, therefore affecting the abundance, the diversity, and the interactions of the species within all of those communities. And our laboratory has the mission of understanding these beautiful ecological interactions, like what I described in the case of the monarch butterfly, but how are those interactions going to be playing out now that we're doing these tremendous impacts on nature via land use change, such as agricultural intensification or overexploitation, or the combination of all of these factors.
And so could you just explain a little bit more why biodiversity conservation is so important? Because particularly when it comes to, for example, agricultural activity and climate change, we hear all the time on the news that biodiversity is important. We should care a lot about biodiversity, but perhaps people do not understand exactly why. So what role does biodiversity play, for example, in ecosystems and evolution?
Fantastic. Yes. So biodiversity is the fundamental element of the constitution of species in a network of interactions in any natural ecosystem. We can talk about biodiversity as the configuration and integration of three elements, three levels of integration. Number one is the genetic diversity within populations. Think of a case of any species of plant or animal in a given ecosystem, you will see that there is variation within that population. Take the case of the human population. We are a species that has genetic diversity. Take the case of blood types. We have blood type A, type B, type O. So there's always genetic diversity within a population. So that's the first level. The second level is the species diversity. In an ecosystem, you have species, multiple species, right? So species diversity. And the third level is the diversity of ecosystems. So if you look at a landscape, you could have riparian forest, you could have savanna, you could have mid-elevation forest, and in the top of the mountains, another kind of ecosystem. So we have three levels of biodiversity integration: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Well, all of those are from the fundamental blocks for the processes that maintain the functioning of ecosystems. And so any disruption in these levels is critical. Now, the biodiversity is central to us because many of the processes that we depend upon are driven by the configuration of the biodiversity and the interactions therein. Take the case, for example, of clean water, right? A forest in a given ecosystem will capture the humidity, will filter the water, and then people in the lowland will have water in quality and quantity. Biodiversity produces tangible products that we use directly: food, medicines, fruit, models to produce new kinds of medicine. So there's an aspect of what's called biochemical prospecting. So some scientists go around the planet looking at plants, at the diversity of plants, to see what other compounds are not known yet that could be used for medicinal purposes. We also depend on biodiversity for the regulation of processes. Think of the bats, those nocturnal mammals that fly at night and eat hundreds or thousands of insects that might eat our crops, and therefore they regulate that service for the production of food. Take the case of many animals that will eat the seeds, the fruit of a plant, and in so doing will disperse the seed to another location and maintain the populations of plants. The pollinators for the cultivation of many crops are essential because without bees and other pollinators, the production of fruit would be very limited. And we also have a fundamental process, the primary productivity is called. The fact that many organisms in the biodiversity of the planet, can capture the energy of the sun, do the photosynthesis process and use the water and produce their bodies, and then the bodies of the organisms that we eat, the plants that we eat, or the animals that we eat. Animals eat the plants and we eat those animals. So the food chain, the base of the food chain depends on biodiversity. And then, Ricardo, an aspect that people rarely takes into consideration, but I think is really relevant, also the value of inspiration and education and motivation. I mean, who would not be emotionally impacted by looking or by being in a natural piece of an ecosystem, in a piece of nature? And so all of these things that we call now ecosystem services are very much essential for the sustenance of our lives as a population. Ultimately, Ricardo, we can think about it, we eat biodiversity. So really, it is crucial that we appreciate the significance of biodiversity and perhaps critically now, what is happening to biodiversity given the human enterprise.
And so what would you say are perhaps some of the main ways by which climate change might impact the dynamics of animal populations?
In multiple ways. For example, in places that used to have a given climatic condition, say temperature, in a given time of the year, and the animals are adapted to those climatic conditions. If the temperature changes and those animals can no longer be able to maintain the populations under that new climatic envelope, those animals, if they were the pollinators of a plant, that will have a local impact on another element of the system, in this case, the plant that they were the pollinators of. Climate change, because of the rapidity with which it is occurring, it is quite possible that many species will not be able to track those climatic changes given the speed with which these are occurring. For example, along a mountain, the temperature is increasing, particularly in the lowlands, and so animals or plants have to migrate higher up in the mountains to maintain or to track their adaptive climatic envelopes, and therefore they will have to move. But if they encounter that the areas where they could move have been already deforested or converted into massive agriculture, they will not be able to move. So you see the combination of factors. And again, climate change being a driver that will change or challenge the species to move to different climatic envelopes that they might or might not be adapted. But it's not only that, because when a plant or an animal moves to another climatic condition, as I said at the beginning, as we discussed at the beginning, is not the plant that lives in a vacuum. The plants will need to have its pollinators, and the pollinators will need to be able to also track that climatic change. And so people can understand the complexity of climate change as a driver of changes in biodiversity, not only in a species in particular, but on the network of species that interact with the components of the ecosystem.
So I would like to ask you now about what some people have been calling the sixth mass extinction. But just before we talk about these mass extinctions specifically, what is a mass extinction? I mean, what is an event that evolutionary biologists classify as a mass extinction?
Yes, very good point, Ricardo. So a mass extinction is a process of catastrophic multi-species, multi-genera, multi-lineages loss, demise of organisms. Normally, we do have a process of extinction. It would be surprising to people who are listening to us in this conversation, it would be surprising to them to know that most of the species that have appeared on the planet have gone extinct. So the fate of the species is to go extinct eventually at some point. But that process usually takes a very long time. But that is a normal rate of extinction. And so we know that there's always extinction processes, but they go at a very low level.
Mm-hmm.
Opposite to that, there is a situation in which a given cataclysmic phenomenon occurs and eliminates that normal rate of extinction, which tends to be very slow, very low, then becomes a massive, almost instantaneous, geologically speaking, cataclysmic phenomenon. The case that is going to be very easy for our audience to understand is going to be the extinction that occurred 65 million years ago, when this meteorite crashed on the Yucatan Peninsula in the town of Chicxulub. That massive crash impact of this meteorite with Earth triggered a number of physical impacts that led to the massive extinction of many organisms, particularly, although not exclusively, the extinction of the dominant animals of the planet at the time, the dinosaurs. But many other groups of organisms actually went extinct at the same time. So when you have these emergent phenomena that imply a massive reduction of the standing biodiversity, implying not a species, not only a set of species, genera, but many lineages at the same time, that is a massive extinction. Now, in the history of life on the planet, we have observed 5 major episodes of massive extinction. Mm-hmm. They have occurred 5 times in the last 550 million years ago. That tells us, Ricardo, that this phenomenon is a relatively rare occurrence in life on the planet. Mm-hmm. As I said, 5 in 550 million years ago, on average, every 110 million years ago occurs a massive extinction by some extinction phenomenon. A massive multiple volcanic eruption, contamination of the atmosphere and so on, or the crash of a meteorite, those kinds of things. Typically, in those cases, a high proportion of the biodiversity disappears. In the extinction of the Permian, it is estimated that about 90% of all the living species of the planet went extinct. In the case of the last extinction, 65 million years ago, massive extinction of dinosaurs and many other organisms, including plants and animals. Interestingly, though, when those massive extinction processes occur, they open up the space for other species to emerge as a consequence of that extinction. But at any rate, there are the normal background extinctions, which occur at a very low level, and then on top of that, the rare massive extinction phenomenon. As we said, there have been 5 in the past, and now we have fears, we have concerns that the human enterprise is moving a process that will create a 6th mass extinction process unless we take action immediately. We are already in a process, we have already triggered a massive extinction process. But in this case, it's driven by one species, our species. But at the same time, we have the capacity to understand what are the consequences of our enterprise. So we should be able to at least ameliorate the rate of extinction and hopefully prevent the demise of our companions, our unique companions on the entire universe. As far as we know, there are no other living organisms that could be our companions anywhere on the universe. So really, this is a very macroscopic, this is a cosmic phenomenon that we are facing. Now, critical things to discuss and convey to our audience, Ricardo, is the fact that it might be difficult for people to see that a massive phenomenon of extinction is occurring because it's a process that occurs relatively slow. But the central point of the extinction today is the extinction of the populations. Let me see if I can explain this. Okay. Imagine that in Latin America, we have the species of a cat, the jaguar. This jaguar used to be present from southern US all the way down to northern Argentina, right?
Mm-hmm.
The species jaguar is not extinct yet. But in many locations in this gigantic distribution from south of the US to northern Argentina, there were many populations of the same species. Well, it turns out that with land use change, massive agriculture, urbanization, and so on, many populations of the jaguar have already gone extinct, even though the species is still present somewhere. And so what we have really is a process of population extinction. When the species at a local level begin to be declining in their abundance because of what we do, and eventually disappear from that location, that is the extinction of that population. When that process of extinction of population occurs throughout the range of distribution of the species, then we have the extinction of the species in the entire face of the planet. We don't see the massive extinction of species at the moment as clearly as we see the massive extinction of populations. 2 points to clarify here. Really, the central point, the critical point of extinction now is extinction of populations. And we don't tend to notice because we tend to hear that, there's still elephants somewhere in Africa, although many populations have gone extinct. So really, the critical issue is extinction of populations. Now, the mass extinctions, the entire extinction of a species from the face of the earth, we have calculated that over the last say from year 1500 to now, there have been about 370 recorded complete extinctions of species of vertebrates. And so we tend to think, well, 370 is not such a big number, but it's not such a big number if we don't look at it in the context. We know that that extinction that occurred in these just few years should have taken thousands of years for that to occur naturally. Were it not because we're present in doing very impactful activities over the course of our civilization. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the extinction of species, we have estimated to be about 100 to 1,000 times more intense than the normal rates of extinction. We're moving towards a massive process of extinction, and the mechanism by which that is occurring is first by the extinction of the populations. If we continue at the same rate of extinction of populations, we will definitely trigger a massive mass extinction episode of the planet.
And I think that there are several different important messages to drive home here, because it is very easy that we see people sort of dismissing this kind of phenomenon. I mean, basically not giving as much importance as it has to the extinction of several different species, or sometimes even being an outright science denier. In this particular case, I guess that many times a climate change denier, and saying that climate change, for example, is not at all driven by human activity or human made. But in this particular case of species extinctions and some other, of course, environmental phenomena that we see as the result of climate change, there are clear signs, and there are also consensual among evolutionary biologists, climate scientists, and other people, that this is actually the result mainly of human activity. Correct?
Yeah, there is no question about that. Starting with the climate change, we do know, I mean, we can do a very simple experiment. If we construct a greenhouse in the yard of our home with glass, right? We do know that we can maintain inside that greenhouse, we can maintain plants that from a tropical area. Even though you live in a cold area, in a cold climatic condition, if you build a greenhouse, you will be able to maintain plants there. Why? Because the radiation that is coming from the sun penetrates through the glass of the greenhouse, will warm the space within the greenhouse, and then the radiation that should go back to the atmosphere is trapped then in the glass. Well, the glass in the planet is the greenhouse gases that we are producing massively. Carbon, but also other critical gases. Methane, for example. Methane is a very intense greenhouse gas. And so we can demonstrate precisely that this phenomenon occurs. We can do experiments, and anyone who is listening to us can do the experiment and prove unequivocally that this phenomenon occurs. Second, we have unequivocal evidence that the concentration of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere has been accumulating dramatically over the last few decades, perhaps a couple of centuries. We have made the measurements. There's no question. The data can be actually seen by anybody who wants to see the data. It started with the Mauna Loa station measuring the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And now we know if we take cores of ice, frozen substrate from the North Poles or the South Poles, and we can actually measure the amount of carbon in those cores going back hundreds and thousands of years and compare what we have today. We can see clearly that since we appeared, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, we have increased dramatically the concentration of greenhouse gases. We increase, no question, we increase the abundance of greenhouse gases, and then we know from the experiments and from the observation that these greenhouse gases create this increase in temperature. Amazingly enough, Ricardo, we do know that naturally, after the last glaciation, the planet had a temperature that remained stable and created the conditions for civilization to occur. But then naturally, the planet underwent a process of going down in temperature. There was a cooling process of the planet. Probably that had to do with the inclination of the Earth's axis. So naturally, the planet was becoming cooler. But then we appeared, and then what that tendency that the planet had, we changed the trajectory in the other way dramatically. So if anybody who's listening to us has an alternative explanation for the climate change driven by humanity, that person should nominate himself or herself to the Nobel Prize, because that would be an incredible thing to accept. We have every single piece of evidence showing that is the case. In the case of the loss of biological diversity, the areas that we know that the areas have had limited limited impact of humans. For example, the most remote locations in the Amazon, the most remote location in the Arctic or the Antarctic, even though those are showing evidence of human activity, but they tend to have a configuration of biodiversity that we don't have in the areas where humanity is developing. Urban areas, intensive agriculture, those kinds of things. So we have very clear evidence. We have natural protected areas that we, humanity, have set aside to safeguard biodiversity in those areas. Well, if you compare those areas that we are protecting actively compared to adjacent areas which we are not protecting, and you measure the biodiversity in those areas, there's no question unequivocally that our human enterprise is creating those changes. So we really need to listen to this conversation, and also if we are not being able to convince the people who are listening to us, they can go back to the literature, they can go back to the clear, tangible evidence that all of these activities are driven by what we do today.
So now for the last part of our conversation today, I would like to ask you a little bit more about potential consequences that this extinction crisis, if it goes on, of course, could have for us humans. So how can it actually impact humans?
Yes, we do know, Ricardo, we can take a historical lesson from the history of the life of the planet. It is interesting to share this with your audience. Mm-hmm. The 5 mass extinctions that have occurred in the past, we know that they obliterated biodiversity. But as we have seen, as we can see in the planet, life has been able to come back. No question about that. Take the case again of the extinction of the dinosaurs. Only 65 million years ago. And now, Ricardo, as far as we can tell now at this moment, or in this last millennia, we have the maximum biological richness that the planet has had in its 4 billion years of evolution. So you can see that after a massive extinction, life came back, and in fact, it became explosive diversification. Problem is, two elements here. One, the process of recovery of biodiversity to the level that we had before the extinction, the mass extinction process, takes millions of years. Probably in the case of vertebrates, the recovery of the same level of richness that we had before is about 10 million years. So for the humanity, for us as species, having the idea that, okay, we can be relaxed because the biodiversity will come back to its previous level is not consolation, because it will take 10 million years. And I don't think you and I are planning to live 10 million years to see the recovery of biodiversity. That is unthinkable for us. But second of all, what comes back after the mass extinction process is very different to what you had before. Again, the case of dinosaurs, at that time, the dominant animals of the planet were the reptiles. Now the dominant animals on the planet are birds and mammals. So very different configuration of biodiversity and many years for it to recover. So that is no consolation for humanity. And another thing is that, to be perfectly bold with the audience who is listening to us, we might be able to survive multiple years, multiple decades, probably multiple centuries with drastic changes on the climatic conditions. And there's going to be tremendous impact on society on those, but probably that is not going to be a massive elimination of the human species. But if we eliminate biodiversity, probably we will not be able to survive just a few decades. We eat biodiversity, we eat the results of biodiversity. So hopefully conveying these ideas to the people who are listening to us will appreciate, and I'm really thankful that you do these kinds of dissemination issues of science, Ricardo, because people can appreciate the significance of this phenomenon, the loss of biodiversity, because, as I say and I insist, the planet will come back. The natural elements of the planet in different modalities and after many millions of years will come back. But what is really the existential threat on the planet is the survival of the species that goes by the name of Homo sapiens. It sounds bold and perhaps like a ghastly conclusion, but I think it is our responsibility to tell things as they are. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we conclude by saying that there is much to be done and much that we can do to prevent this massive extinction. First of all, having an educated and a society that is well-informed society by mechanisms such as the one you do, these dissemination episodes or podcasts, is very important, because we need to understand this phenomenon not only within the scientific community, but the public in general. Once we have this appreciation, when all of this become part of the imagination of society at large, they will be able to demand, when you have elections in a given country or in a given town, that the candidates will present an agenda as to how they will address climate change, biodiversity change, land use change, and so on. So we need to have this bottom-up pressure or impulse from us by being prepared. We need to protect what we have of natural reserves at the moment. Only 17%, about over 17% of nature has been set aside for conservation. We need to make sure that those areas are definitely well maintained and safeguard biodiversity, because they will be the source of repopulation of biodiversity in other areas if we become more wiser and protect other areas as well. In addition to that, Ricardo, many of the areas where we have the last remains of biodiversity on the planet belong to indigenous and native populations. So we need to understand that and appreciate the significance of those populations in safeguarding biodiversity for us at the moment. We need to find mechanisms of compensating, making sure that they will not be forced to have a life that forces them to continue impacting nature. We need to compensate. There's a thing called payment for environmental services. In many countries in Latin America and other parts of the world, There are institutions who are financially supporting local communities if they commit to maintain their natural ecosystem, because they are the stakeholders of this biodiversity, the main stakeholders of this biodiversity. We need to think about our habits, our feeding habits as a human species. The excess in consumption of meat brings about much deforestation, brings about much carbon emission, it brings about health problems. I don't mean to say that tomorrow we should be vegetarian, everybody, but we should be able to gradually balance our diet in such a way that we reduce all of those multiple drivers of change, negative change in our natural resources. And of course, Ricardo, I think we need to appreciate the beauty and inspiration that we have from nature and biodiversity, because that is also, enrichment of our spirit and also a moral, ethical appreciation of what we have today is a result of an incredible process of trial and error that took 4 billion years for us to have the richness that we have on the planet today. I think it's a cosmic responsibility to enjoy, appreciate, and in so doing, hopefully safeguarding our own species.
So I think that's a great note to end on, Dr. Dirzo. And just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, so I would be delighted to be contacted in the internet. If you go to my email, rdirzo, RDIRZO at Stanford EDU. With that, you will be able to find the website of my laboratory, and you will be able to see the many publications that we have on these topics. And also you will be able to see the materials that we have for educational purposes to kids and to members of the public, and also the novelties of what we're working on, and the students that work with us in our projects, the communities that we interact with in around the world. And so welcome to be contacted via the internet and via the website of our laboratory. Thank you.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Dirzo, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Ricardo, very much. And thank you for what you're doing for in this mission that we have to affront collectively.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Baka, Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernardini Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.